So today is I think, really the kind of start of the different stories that are in First Chronicles. That have a sort of a historical narrative. Whereas the other chapters that we've been looking at has been lots of names and lots of little anecdotal stuff in regard to David's leadership and just the men that were surrounding him, and we did spend a fair bit of time looking at that. But the emphasis that Chronicles has is about spiritual things. It's about worship. It's about God being in the middle of the national narrative, in a sense, in the national history. And when God is in the middle there and people want God to be in the middle, then things go well. But then we'll also read about stories about certain kings and things that didn't want God, and they brought other gods in to replace the Lord God of heaven. And then things went quite septic after that. So, but today we have a kind of a two-pronged story, and that is David wants to bring the ark back to Jerusalem because there's two things going on. There's the issue of the first go at it, which went bad, and we'll look at why that went bad. But David perseveres and finds out, well, what did he do wrong? And then he does it right, and then there's great joy as a result. But just to give a bit of background in terms of the where the ark was and why it had to be brought back, is if you read back in First Samuel chapter 4 and following, it talks about how the Israelites, when they were really in quite a spiritual sort of wilderness, they weren't walking with God well. Their own priests sort of didn't really have it together. That was when Eli was alive and Samuel was starting to come on the scene. And of course, Samuel was a godly man and sought to have a godly influence, but really the people weren't sort of listening too much, and they went up against the Philistines, and the Philistines were a very well-armed and very well-organized sort of enemy. And because the children of Israel were not walking with God, they sought to sort of deal with the situation in their own wisdom. And but they thought, well, if we get the ark out and put the ark out on the front line, maybe the ark will do something. And and you can't treat God like that. You can't treat God like a dog on a lead and then let him go and tell him to go and sick the enemy or something like this. And that's how they were treating God. And the ark was captured, and Hophni and Phinehas, who were Eli's sons, they were killed in the process, and they were the ones to mind the ark. And yet they, because they weren't walking with God, they were very immoral men, and sleeping with women at the tabernacle meeting and all this kind of stuff. So they were just immoral guys and not really interested in anything about God, but they had that responsibility, and so they went ahead and brought the ark out and set it out in the battlefield, hoping that God would launch a lightning attack or something like this. But the ark was captured by the Philistines, and they thought it was a great prize, and they took it to the house of Dagon, which was their god. And Dagon was half fish, half man. His upper torso looked like a man, and then his bottom bit looked a bit like a fish. So they took it to the temple of Dagon, and so the next morning, when the Philistines came to their Dagon temple, they found that Dagon had fallen flat in his face, and which was kind of embarrassing in front of the ark, because they had brought the ark as like an offering or something for their god. And so they set Dagon back up in his pedestal, And then the next morning after that, they came back and found that Dagon was on his, had fallen over again, but this time his head was lopped off and his palms of his hands were lopped off. And so the Philistines then realized that what they were dealing with was something far more powerful than just a gold box, you know. And so they then took the ark and they sent it off to one of their other cities, and it says that the hand of God was heavy upon them, and there was a lot of sickness, a lot of problems, a lot of death. Some people think that the experiences that some of these people were having was actually, Black Death. It was, bubonic plague that was taking place because there was a problem with a lot of rats, and they also had a lot of problems with tumors, which is probably better understood if you drill down into the language as hemorrhoids. So they were having problems with rats and hemorrhoids, and this wasn't a good situation. So the ark kept on going from kind of town to town and creating problems and difficulties. And then what they did is they put the ark on a cart and hitched up a couple of milking cows that had never pulled a cart before. And the milking cows then took it to a place called Kirjath Jearim, where it then sat for about 20 years. And that was then during the time of Saul. And so David then has come to power here, and the ark is not where it should be. It is not being used in worship. The ark was the central piece of furniture that resided in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle meeting. And as you can see there in the picture, where the light is between the angels, that's where the Shekinah glory of God, for lack of a better term, resided. And so that lid on top of the box there, on top of the ark, is what's referred to as the mercy seat. And then what is contained in the ark was the 10 Commandments. Now there were some other things in there. There was Aaron's rod that budded, and also a jar of manna. But those things were then removed for whatever reason, and the only thing that was really talked about as being inside the ark was the 10 Commandments that Moses had received from Mount Sinai from God. So, but it was once a year that the priest would go into the Holy of Holies and offer a sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, and that blood would be sprinkled then on top of the mercy seat. So the ark was a very, very important piece of furniture and instrumental in the worship of God. But the Israelites basically treated it with disdain. It got captured. It really demoralized the Israelites quite a lot. But it's not until David comes and David says, look, I want to restore proper worship to Israel. And so 2 Chronicles 13 is the start of this. So we'll take a look at this. So the ark is returned. David has good intentions, but he has wrong method in terms of how to go about this. And oftentimes we have good intentions before God and before people, but the difficulty with David, though, was that David was enthusiastic, but he was immature and probably didn't have things sort of read up in the right way. And this is what the first 4 verses of chapter 13 say. It says, then David consulted with the captains of thousands and hundreds and with every leader. And David said to all the assembly of Israel, if it seems good to you, and if it is of the Lord our God, let us send out to our brethren everywhere who are left in all the land of Israel, and with them to the priests and the Levites who are in their cities and their common lands, that they may gather together to us. And let us bring the ark of our God back to us, for we have not inquired at it since the days of Saul. And then all the assembly said that they would do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. And Now, as you can see in those first number of verses, there was a lot of consultation with men first. Okay, so David consulted with the captains of thousands and hundreds, and he said to the assembly of Israel, if it seems good to you. And then he kind of uses this extra language of, and if it's of the Lord our God, let's go and do this thing. So, it's the right thing to do, but the consultation of it was with man first. And David didn't, there's not a prayer or a conversation that David has with God saying, God, I want to bring the ark back and restore worship. And I believe that if David had done that, God would have put it in his heart to get it done right and not wrong, as we'll see here in a minute or two. So now, everybody, because they were spiritually minded, but yet immature, says the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. People were going in the right direction. Their direction of travel was good, but God, holds us to a standard, and we have to watch that standard. So this is what happens. Looking down a few verses here, so we're not going to do a verse by verse kind of blow by blow talk about this, but anyways, just to highlight things. So verse 7 says, and so they carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio drove the cart. Now, there's a problem here, and for those of us that may be novices to this kind of thing, we might go, well, what's the problem? It's the Philistines had the thing on a cart and went from town to town, and yes, they had issues and problems, but it is there an issue with transportation? And the answer to that is yes, there is an issue with transportation. The ark was to be carried via poles that were stuck through rings alongside of the ark. But here it says it was carried on a new cart, and it's almost like this is the new technology or something like that. Put it on a new cart. There's not a problem there. It's new wheels. It's not rotten or anything like that. Sounds good. Now, as we know with the names of people, they tend to be quite important. I'll be highlighting some names today, not all of them, because when we get to chapter 15, there's a bucket load of them. But anyway, there was this man Uzzah, and his name means strength. But the name of God is not in his name. And then you have Ahio, which means brotherly, and and the names of these two men sound respectable and sound good, but God's not in their names, and so they're probably good guys. They're probably nice men and well-intentioned, but as a man once said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So, so these men are just doing what they're been told to do, and but then there is a problem that occurs, and that is in verse 9 and 10. It says, when he came to Chidon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to hold the ark, for the oxen stumbled. And then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and he struck him because he put his hand to the ark, and he died there before God. And there's a little picture there of Uzzah putting his hand out to the ark, and so Uzzah probably just reacted and thought, look, the thing's about ready to couch, so we need to steady it up, but nobody took into consideration, well, how do you transport this thing? What is the right thing to do? It was just all full of the wrong method. And so God struck out against Uzzah because he put his hand upon the ark. That's why the thing had poles in it, was because The poles were the only thing that particular priests of a particular family were supposed to use to carry the ark. The ark itself was not to be touched, because the things of man cannot touch the things of God. So this whole thing then causes a bit of a difficulty here in David's mind, because there was an awful lot of fanfare. Everybody was happy. It says there in verse 8, it says, then David and all Israel played music before God with all their might, with singing on harps and stringed instruments and tambourines and cymbals and trumpets. It was a big to do. So but as soon as this happened, I tell you, it really took the wind out of their sails. So if we go and look at the next verse there, verses 11 and 12, it says, then David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah, and therefore that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of God that day, saying, how can I bring the ark of God to me? And now, if the story stopped here, and this is where it ended, this would be a very, very sad episode in David's life. He would have allowed a circumstance basically just to really derail him and just cause him to go, I can't do this, and so and he is asking that question, but he is asking it with the intention of saying, I want to get this right. So we have David's reaction here, and there's quite a lot in these couple of verses that we should take note of. And that is that he had anger at himself. It says, David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah. And now, I think David, being a man that understood responsibility and understood that he was the one that was organizing this and therefore carried the can, and the buck stopped with him and all that sort of stuff. He was primarily, he wasn't angry at God because he understood that God would not break out against Uzzah in an unjustified fashion. God never does anything in an unjustified way. He always holds to his word and holds to his to what is right. So I think that David is angry with himself because he knew he got something wrong here, and then it involved the anger of God, which wasn't a pleasant thing to experience. And then David says, or in verse 12 there, David was afraid of God that day. So he then realizes that he got it wrong. Something went bad here, and so David was then fearful of God. Now I know we've had a big discussion a lot of times ago about the fear of God and what that's about. But I think David here is more nearly terrorized of God. It's like, God has killed a man justifiably because of what this man did, but David's responsible for it. And so this causes him to be, this is scary stuff here. But then he asks this question, but he asked the question really more about how to get it right. It's not so much about, how can I do this? I'm not going to, there's no way I can rectify this. And sometimes we get things, in our life where we do get it wrong, and we can curl up and die and just go, you know what, I can't do this. But God doesn't want us to arrive at that sort of mentality. He wants us to ask him, how can I get it right? And what do I need to do in order to get it right? Because God wants you to get it right. There was a situation there the other day. I'm developing a new website for Stars, and Roy had asked me to do something in regard to the website, which I, in my own head, I didn't know how to do it, but I said, well, sure, it can be done because I've seen it on other websites and so on, but it wasn't something in my gift in terms of being able to produce it. So anyway, I went ahead, looked it up on the internet, found out how to do it, and implemented it. I had to get a bit of help from somebody, and that man helped me to adjust it and get the coding right and all this sort of business. And but the thing is that I could have said, when Roy asked me to do this thing, I could have said, you know what, I don't know how to do this, and I'm not going to bother finding out how to do it. I just can't do it. So I can't is a bad piece of vocabulary for a Christian. Yes, maybe we can't in our own natural strength, but God can and can bring better things and right things into our life and help us to do that. So I said, well, I don't know how to do that, but I'll find out how to do it. And in the process, it kind of, and it still is in the process of kind of getting rectified and sorted out. But I am actually learning quite a bit about how to do this process. But I could have just said, you know what, I can't do this. So, but I don't want to go down that road because that's defeatist. And God does not want us to be in a defeatist mode. He wants us to take the bull by the horns and say, right, learn from me. And we'll get this right. Now, David, then in the last couple of verses of this chapter, would not move the ark with him into the city of David, but took it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of God remained with the family of Obed-Edom in his house 3 months, and the Lord blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had. And really what that says to me is where God is, God blesses, so even though the ark had not gotten to its destination perhaps in the right way, God's not going to then, judge everybody for it. And so David took opportunity to look at things, assess things, and so he had the thing moved into the house of this man Obed-Edom. And interestingly enough, Obed-Edom is mentioned quite a lot in chapter 15 as a man who is involved in the bringing of the ark into the city of Jerusalem. So and I'm sure that Obed-Edom, when he had gotten the ark initially, was probably going, why are you bringing this thing to me? This thing, it's caused all sorts of problems down in the Philistine part of the world, and they when they actually sent the ark back toward Israel, they actually packed in a chest, a little box next to the ark, golden rats and golden tumors or golden hemorrhoids, if you can imagine what those things even look at. But so that was the offering that the Philistines had put next to the ark, golden tumors and golden rats. But I'm sure there was lots of stories about harshness and death and difficulties and disease and all kinds of stuff, and then we have this episode with Uzzah touching the ark, and then he dies, so having the ark of God being delivered to you with that kind of track record is not looking too good, so but Obed-Edom, Obed means servant, but he's a foreign man because his family heritage is from Edom, which would be associated with Esau, who was Jacob's brother and that kind of thing. But so those people wouldn't have been great lovers of God in their past. But we have this man who's then associated with Israel, kind of at least on the periphery. And so God comes into his life, and the ark is there for 3 months, and it says that the Lord blesses the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had. And I'm sure that, that was unexpected in Obed-Edom's mind. But what a great blessing it was having God in the middle of his life. And so there's a great little lesson there of how important it is that God is in the middle of how we think. God is in the middle of how we talk. God is in the middle of what we do, and God is in the middle of our circumstances. So now David learns from his mistakes here. And so chapter 14 is a lesson about trusting the Lord. Now, we're not going to go through all that chapter because I want to spend more time concentrating on the whole ark situation. But now, chronologically, chapter 14 takes place before chapter 13. Now, that might sound a bit Irish, but Chronicles, what you have to realize is that their emphasis is on spiritual realities, not so much about what happened sequentially. Now, Chronicles is fairly sequential in how it deals with history, but in this particular occasion, you have this situation with the ark in chapter 13, and then you have this kind of odd kind of interlude in chapter 14 about David's family life, wives that he had, and kids, and so on, and also about how he had gone up against the Philistines, but the thing was that he consulted God about how to do this. And there was 2 occasions there where God gave him different types of instruction in order to deal with the enemy. But what it is really, and I think the reason that this chapter 14 is placed in the middle of the story, because chapter 15 is all about how then David got it right in terms of bringing the ark back. And so, but it's a spiritual lesson. So the chapters, as it says there, but as a spiritual lesson, it is placed in the position to show the importance of looking to the Lord for everything in every circumstance. So, so David looks to God about these battles, and God gives him instruction. See, in chapter 13, he didn't look to God. He looked to man. He says, if it sounds good to everybody else, sure, let's go for it. So whereas chapter 14 is a spiritual lesson strategically placed, because then chapter 15 comes along and says David consulted God. So even though chronologically it's in a different order, it's providing for a spiritual lesson. So now the ark is returned. Again, good intentions, and this time right method. So in chapter 15 here in verses 1 through 3, it says, and David built houses for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. And then David said, no one may carry the ark of God but the Levites, for God has chosen them to carry the ark of God and to minister before him forever. And David gathered all Israel together at Jerusalem to bring up the ark of God, the ark of the Lord, to its place, which he had prepared for it. So, so what's being really talked about here is that David, asked the question, how can I bring the ark of God to me? So he goes and gets that question answered. And so in verse 2, this is the start of this answer. It says, no one may carry the ark of God but the Levites. He had the ark of God on a cart, and he thought, sure, the Philistines had it on a cart. These cows have been running around with it on a cart, and it seemed okay. And it seems like, doing things the way the world does seems okay. Well, it's not okay. There's a higher standard that God holds us to. So and he realizes that God has chosen them, these particular Levites, to carry the ark of God and to minister before him forever. So anyway, David then gets everybody together again and brings it up to the place that he prepared for it. But he involves some different men, and these are men that are now they're listed in verses 4 through to 10 as people that are coming from various sorts of tribes in regard to the Levites and sons of Aaron and all these kinds of things. But then the list gets distilled down to the key men, which are then in verse 11. And so we have here David called for Zadok, Abiathar, for Uriel, Asaiah, Joel, Shemaiah, Eliel, and Aminadab. So just to look at those particular men and their names, Zadok and Abiathar were the main priests. Eventually, Zadok sort of became more prominent individual, but the name Zadok means righteous, as you see there on the screen, and then Abiathar means father of abundance. And so you have two men where really it talks about doing the right thing. And Abiathar means father of abundance. So, you know, there's an enthusiasm. You're putting, you know, all your eggs into the basket of serving the Lord, you know. So, and then as a result, there's an abundance there. And then there's these other Levites, who is the tribe of priests. Uriel, that means flame of God. So, you know, it says to me about being, you know, consumed with God. Asaiah, the Lord has made. Joel, the Lord is God. Shemaiah, the Lord has heard. Eliel, God is my God. And Aminadab, people of freedom. And I found that the last name kind of interesting. I looked it up there. It means, you know, people of liberality, and really the idea is freedom. You know, we have a clear conscience now because we're doing the right thing. See, when you do the wrong thing, there's always, you know, the proverbial devil sitting on your shoulder, you know, whispering in your ear, going, you know, you're not quite right. You're getting it wrong, but sure, it's all about you. So do what you want, you know. And so we're unbalanced, and we're just a bit in the wrong space. So so the men that are involved here are very key individuals, and again, when you're doing the right thing, there's freedom in your mind, and so these men, you know, I mean, all these Levites, you know, Uriel, Asaiah, Joel, Shemaiah, Eliel in particular, God is in their name all over the place. So they know God hears, they know God makes, you know, the God, you know, God is in their midst, and they're consumed with God. So, you know, it's a great verse just to look at and to consider. So now, as David sort of moves on with this thing, there's a few sorts of highlights I want to make in regard to some of these verses. So in verse 12, it says, and he said to them, you are the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites. Sanctify yourselves, you and your brethren, that you may bring up the ark of the Lord God of Israel to the place I have prepared for it. So the first thing that David gives here, as I have there in blue, is instruction. Instruction is a terribly important thing. You know, in order for us to do the right thing in life, and especially spiritually, is we need to be instructed. We need to be told what to do. Why do we need to be told what to do? Because we don't know what to do. So, I know people that profess faith, but they don't feel that they need to be then under the sound of the word of God. They might read it for themselves, but they may come to bad conclusions. So that's why God has positioned elders, deacons, pastors, people that are gifted in teaching and this kind of thing to bring about instruction for the people, because it says in Ephesians where it talks about let me just read that verse 2 so that I don't get it wrong. Sorry. So in terms of gifting for people, it says for he gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body, in other words, building up of the body of Christ, till we have all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro, carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, and cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting, and so on it goes. But the whole reason that God puts various sorts of people in position is so that instruction can be given. And so the instruction that is given here is, first of all, to sanctify. And what being sanctified means is quite literally, it means to be set apart. It means to be brought from being in common use to holy use. And so God wants to do that for us. And that is a process. Sanctification, as we've said many times before, is the process of God progressively delivering us from the power of sin in our life. It's different from justification, where justification is an immediate deliverance from the penalty of sin in your life. So sanctification is a progressive deliverance from the power of sin. And so, you don't just sit there and say, okay, I'm sanctified. There was a cleansing ritual that the priest went through. There was a process that they went through. There were things that they read. There were things they prayed. There was a fellowship that was there to look after each other, because it talks about, you and your brethren, sanctify yourselves, you and your brethren. You need to do this together. And and you're going from, being common in your mind to being then holy in your mind and in your body and in your spirit and your soul and so on, for the purposes of God. And and they had to do that in order to bring up the ark of the Lord God of Israel. So you couldn't bring it up and then sanctify yourself. There's an order here. Instruction always has order to it. When I was looking up the thing for the website there, and getting the program code for the little what they call a widget to work, you can't just throw a bunch of words into a thing and hope that it works. It has to be ordered, and it has to be ordered in a certain sort of way so that it will then do what it needs to do. So so there is an order. But the next thing that that comes really as a result of instruction, when you get instruction, you then see perhaps the places where you're strong, but you also see the places in which you're weak. And so David highlights this. So there's a realization. So it says in verse 13, for because you did not do it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us, because we did not consult him about the proper order. So very, very important verse because David doesn't, you know, he does say to them quite specifically, look, you did not do it the first time. And citing particular individuals in terms of the Levitical priesthood. Look, boys, this was your responsibility. You didn't get it right. But because David is carrying the can, because he is the leader, because he is the king, because he's the buck stops with him, refers to the Lord our God. So he's not saying the Lord your God or the Lord that God or something like that. It is our God. This is our collective responsibility. And he says it broke out against us because we didn't consult him about the proper order. So he is entering into this responsibility. But also, at the same time realizing that there is individual responsibility. So there's individual responsibility and there's corporate responsibility. And so they didn't do it the first time, should have, but they didn't. And so they recognize that that was the wrong thing to do. The first time should have been, we speak to God. So, and that's what David, or what's highlighted in chapter 14, is David goes to God about these battles. But he comes to an important word here. It says, because we did not consult him. So, part of the realization of life is about this consultation with God. We need to ask God about what to do and how to go about our lives, because we come to Christ because we're in the wrong. We've gotten it wrong. Our life is a shambles. It's a mess. It's now some of us come from backgrounds where we didn't have any problem in terms of things on the earth and having stuff, and we weren't down and out or something like this, but we were down and out spiritually, and so God does bring us to those points, but how important it is to realize that we need to consult him. God has to be in the middle of our thinking process. He has to be in the middle of our decision-making process. He has to be in the middle of the words that we say, and he has to be in the middle of what we do. Now, it continues on here with then verse 14 and 15, where it says, and so the priests and the Levites sanctified themselves to bring up the ark of the God of Israel, and the children of the Levites bore the ark of God on their shoulders by its poles, as Moses had commanded according to the word of the Lord. So this is the action. We have instruction, we have a realization, and now we have action. And so what they then do is that they sanctify themselves. So they're given the instruction of doing that, but they could have just stood there and sucked their thumb, but they didn't. They actually got on with it. They because there was this realization, or the instruction and the realization, then action then follows that. So they went and did that, and they did it according to the book, and they did this in order to bring the ark of God up. Because that was the purpose, and they got the order correct. Because if you look back at the previous verse, sanctify yourselves that you may bring up, and now we here have the Levites sanctify themselves to bring up. Okay. So and they bore the ark according to the command. Now it says there in verse 15 that the children of the Levites bore the ark of God on their shoulders. Now that is exactly how they were supposed to carry it. There were these poles, and it's interesting when you read about the instruction about the construction of the ark over in Exodus 25, that the ark was not a huge thing. It was only a few feet long by a couple of feet by a couple of feet, basically. So it wasn't a large object, but it was probably heavy enough, because it was acacia wood that was then overlaid with pure gold. Now, there was rings, 4 rings that were put onto the ark for the purpose of then these poles to be inserted. Now, it says quite clearly in Exodus 25 that the poles were then to be inserted, but then the poles were never to be taken out. So, but they went into these rings. Now, traditionally, if you read some of the literature of the old rabbis and this kind of thing, what they believed in regard to the rings was because the ark of God was a holy thing unto God, that it, with its rings, could not touch anything that man was then handling. So the poles that were then being touched by man and handled by man, they those poles actually didn't touch any aspect of the rings. It was kind of like suspended in the middle of the ring. So the edge of the pole didn't touch the ring. It was almost like it was hanging in some sort of magnetic field or something like that. But it wouldn't have been magnetism, because gold doesn't react to magnetism. But it was that kind of a thing. And so, God is set apart. God is holy, and God cannot be touched by the things of man. And but yet God wanted this thing to be transported by man, but there was a very distinct demarcation in terms of where God was and where man was. So anyway, the Levites then did as Moses had commanded, according to the word of the Lord. And then there was joy. When you receive your instruction and you have a realization, you act on these things, then it's good. There is rejoicing. So verse 16 says, then David spoke to the leaders of the Levites to appoint their brethren to be the singers, accompanied by instruments of music, stringed instruments, harps, cymbals, and by raising the voice with resounding joy. And so what a great day, because we're doing it right, and we've done it according to the book. And so we're happy. And so the following verses, verse 17 and following, there's a whole pile of names in there, and Obed-Edom is part of it. But there's many men that are involved in the playing of instruments, singing, and really the execution of worship, which is a great thing. And so lots of people involved. See, when you look at the chapter before, chapter 13, there was a lot of people there, but there was only 2 guys involved, Uzzah and Ahio, named, and it wasn't right. Here in chapter 15, you have a lot of named individuals, and they're singing. Their names talk about the things of God, and we'll not take the time to look at all these names. A lot of them are similar to the ones that we have looked at in the past, and but there is just great joy because things are being done right. So now, just to skip along the chapter here a little bit, because it's again just lots of names. But in verse 26, this is a very, very important verse. So chapter 26, and says, so it was when God helped the Levites who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that they offered 7 bulls and 7 rams. Now, sometimes when we read these verses, we kind of take things for granted. But when you get the instruction, when you realize where you've gotten it wrong and what you need to do, and you put those things into action, and then there is joy amongst yourselves, well, guess what? God helps. So it was when God helped. You know, when they were transporting the ark by a cart, God was not obliged in any way, shape, or form to help that situation. He wasn't. He didn't go, "Oh boy, they're doing it wrong, so I better step in and go and sort it out." You know, the ark was being transported badly, wrongly, and the oxen stumbled, and the thing cowed, and the thing was about ready to flip, and your man puts his hand. You know, so you know, there was no help from God there. But when you do things right, God helps. And so, I can just imagine. I remember hearing a guy preach about this one time, and he says it was almost like, the angels of God came and guided the feet of the Levites who were bearing the ark and carrying it by its poles, and and making sure that there was no stumbling, and nothing went on, because it was done right. God helped them, and because this is the stuff that honors God. This is about the worship of God, and God's desire is to be pleased with us. And there was a lot of offering going on. In fact, it says that if you read the parallel account in Samuel, it talks about how there was a sacrifice that was done, every 6 or 7 paces. I think, just look back at that and see if I get this right here. Yeah, 6 paces. They sacrificed oxen and fatted sheep. So, they where it was being brought up from, Kirith Jearim was about 20 miles away, and so that's a lot of sacrificing every 6 paces, So, but they wanted to get this right, and they wanted to make sure that they were putting everything they could into getting the ark back for the purpose of worship. So God helped in this situation. But finally, how this chapter ends in kind of an odd way. David is clothed in fine linen. He has the singers around him, and it says that he danced, before God, where it says in verse 28, and all Israel brought up the ark of the covenant of the Lord with shouting, and with sound of the horn, trumpets, and cymbals, making music with stringed instruments. But then in verse 29, it says, and it happened as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came to the city of David, that Michal, Saul's daughter, and that was David's first wife, which Saul gave him, basically, through a bit of a deal, looked through a window and saw King David whirling and playing music, and she despised him in her heart. And that's how this chapter ends. Now, Michal, because she is Saul's daughter, is a remnant of the past. And so I look at her and I say she represents the past. And that's why I have there, just after the verse number there, the past will despise and try to drag you back. And because anytime we seek to follow God and to do what's right, again, receive this instruction, get this realization, put it into action, have the joy of the Lord as our strength around us, and God helps as a result. Well, guess what? The past and the world and all that kind of stuff is going to despise you. They're going to look at you. They're going to make comment. They're going to say, "What are you at? What are you doing? That's silly. That's stupid." And it seeks to then put you back. Happens a lot. Anytime that any of us are involved in spiritual things and going and doing the right things for God and seeking God's help and all that kind of stuff. Um, and I found this past week. I was going out to see a variety of men about their issues, and it seemed like just before some of those things took place, there was an upheaval of some kind, whether it was emotionally or physically or practically or something like that. There was something that the devil was using just to sort of sling into the mix, throwing a wrench or a spanner into the works and trying to upend us, and upend me, and and oftentimes a lot of that stuff all links into your past, because the devil will remind us about our past. He'll say, well, look, you did this in the past. Northern Ireland is great for casting up. They can write a book about casting up the past, but God does not look back at our past and assess us based on our past, because the Lord Jesus Christ has died for that, and so the guilt of all that has been taken away. The regret of it has been taken away. Yes, we have the remnants of those things, but we do not concentrate on that stuff. We don't get stuck in the reproach of it. We move forward. We go forward in the strength of God. But Saul's daughter Michal was trying to do this, and she just saw David being joyful and happy in what he was doing for God, and she despises him in her heart. And we know from the other scriptures that as a result of this, Michal never had children, which was seen as a curse from God. When a woman could not bear children, that was seen as a curse from God. So, and as far as I understand, Michal was the only one of David's wives that didn't have any kids. Not that having a multiplicity of wives was any great thing either. The Bible doesn't condone that. But anyway, it's another discussion for another time. But I think there's lots of things to learn here in terms of this ark being brought back. We can learn from David's mistakes, and we can learn from how David then got it right.